Hello and welcome back. Today is December 29th of 2019, which marks the final videos and articles that will be released through the Rural Heritage and Traditional Food Internship program of 2019. For this month, I chose to focus on the theme surrounding documentation of intangible rural traditions and practices with a special focus on goat cheese. But let's be honest, all of my topics were in some way, one or the other, connected to goat cheese. And the reasoning for this is I wanted to utilize the internship to construct and navigate the multifaceted realms that operate in, around, and through the rural tradition practices of Estonia, particularly the Estonian goat cheese farmers. So this video will have excerpts from the article that I wrote in conjunction, as well as more delving deeper into different theories, practices, and methodologies, and so forth. And while I do work with 3 separate goat farms in Estonia and their farmers, for this article, for the sake of time and brevity, I chose to focus only on one and my experiences as well as methodologies of documentation of these intangible traditions and practices of this one farmer. The article and therefore the video will be constructed in 3 segments. The first, I would like to draw an excerpt from the article that kind of gives a little bit of a story background to the documentation process, as well as what this farmer Anne, as we will call her, does, believes, values, and so forth. And then we'll lead our way into the oral and sonic ethnography that was employed in the field. And then closing out, we will focus on the visual aspect of the documentation process. So, without further ado, let's begin. Gentle bubbles started to erupt from the surface of the fresh goat's milk in the tall silver pot that had sat over the small fire. Anne clicked the gas burner off and lifted the pot over to the left side of the stove to cool. Now it'll cool for about an hour, she explained, as she stirred in the rennet, an animal byproduct that reintroduces enzymes to the heated milk to create a chain of reactions which will result in cheese curds. We had stood in Anne's kitchen, a space of constant cooking, baking, eating, and of course, creating. It was warm, slightly humid, and it smelt of fresh bread and boiled goat's milk. Anne was pacing herself, moving confidently and silently throughout the kitchen, from the stove to the sink, then back to the stove, with punctuations of explanations that pierced through the calm silence. Anne wasn't much of a speaker, much like Estonians, but rather of a person of ergonomic usage of speech, speaking with minimal yet well-weighted words. Rather, it was I who was nervous and peppering her with questions, which she gallantly took into stride. Anne beckoned me to come back to the stove once the hour had passed. "This is my favorite part," Anne said through a small smile. "It's very simple and maybe doesn't make sense, but it is my favorite." She grabs a clean knife and takes it to the milk that sat in the pot. But when the knife touched the milk, it didn't ripple as liquid does, but rather it pierced a mass that looked liquid yet was solid. Anne lifted a part of the sliced sliver up, checking to ensure that the curds were ready to be drained and separated from the whey. She carried it over the cooled pot to the sink where she had prepared the necessary tools of the craft, a strainer and a black bucket. She whisked to break up the curds in the pot and slowly poured partitions of the curd into the strainer while the whey drained down into the bucket beneath. This process was repeated till the curd and whey were segregated. This case study is constructed around the farming experience with goats, but ultimately the focus centers around the handicraft goods that are made from the goat's milk itself and the meanings that are formulated through and around the tangible goods. With Anne, she made things such as creamy and delicate fresh goat's cheese, ecru-colored goat's milk butter, herbed goat's cheese, and luscious olive oil, and a few other edible commodities. However, this case study is also developed in such a way that documented crucial aspects of rural traditions and practices through interviews, participant observation, as well as audio recording and film photography, which will be talked about further on. Anne called out to the vast field that lay before us. Kitse, 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 Anne had called her goats. And the goats were hidden amongst the late autumn brush, but when they had emerged, the soft thundering of their hooves that made contact with the soft earth provoked me to take a step back and a bit behind Anne. They had sniffed at our pockets, searching for hidden treats and treasures while foraging for other earthly delights near us. Anne petted the nearest goat to her and began to tell me the story of how she came to this life. It was an easy decision to move from the city to the countryside, but finding the right place took a bit more time. Eventually, Anne and her family found the perfect house and moved to the land where the wind whispers through the leaves and the sounds of earth that echoed in the night. I didn't want to live in the city, she explained. I never really connected with the pace of life there, the demands, the noise, the stress. Coming back to the quiet rural life was a dream, one that I had wanted to make happen, she detailed. Her farm was humbly large, with expansive fields for a herd of 23 goats to roam and forage, her laying chickens and clutch of turkeys, 2 dogs, 2 cats, and a young, energetic boy of 6 years old to run and play. A small patch of forest lay behind her house, and the main road softly hummed in the background. Oftentimes, the data that is reflected from the research, as well as the researcher themselves, is situated primarily within the ocular methodology formats. So, what I mean by ocular is the eye. And this encompasses both I as in the self, the being, as well as EYE as in the bodily, to see the eyes. And to conceptualize this, I want to draw on this brilliant article written by Stephanie Daza and Walter S. Gershon. And their article is titled Beyond Ocular Inquiry, Sound, Silence, and Sonification. What the authors do here is they kind of lead the reader into why ocular inquiry or ocular methodologies has dominated the research and researchers' methodologies, as well as the data. And that's primarily because the eyesight is probably the most important or heavily relied upon bodily receptor of information, sense, being, and etc., etc. And Gershon and Daza kind of explain that sonic methodologies have oftentimes been dismissed, whether actively dismissed or inadvertently dismissed, and that they kind of explain why this has severe limitations through the first aspect, that eyesight actually has a lot more limitations. This goes aside the personal capabilities or inhibition or limitations that a person might have, whether you're deaf, blind, have less than superb hearing or eyesight, and so forth. Aside from those peculiarities or specificities, eyesight tends to be more limiting in the sense that it is framed. It's only located on the front of the body. Sight is also limiting in the sense that even if it is for a nano of a second, a fraction of a second, there are interruptions in eyesight, such as blinking, twitching, eyes adjusting to the sun. When you enter into a dark place, the eyes take a moment to adjust, and so forth. Sound and hearing does have its own limitations. However, not the same as of sight. See, hearing doesn't really have limitations. There's no blinking of the ears. There are no twitches of the ears that interrupts the information that is coming into our ears. And so that's what Gershon and Daza kind of touch upon. And they further their argument by, quote unquote, bodies are always already engaged in multisensory analysis as part of their becoming with and in the world. They affect and are affected by processes, bodies, objects, feelings, ideas, and ecologies. Sensation is metaphysical and social learning. So this quote only bolsters their argument of having a multi-sensory driven methodology, framework, and so forth, particularly focusing on the conjunction of ocular and sonic. They close out this article by stating that sounds underscore the impossibility of singularity and binaries and of incompleteness of the ocular. They interrupt the overly cited metaphors that govern our understandings about qualitative research. Another article that I would like to draw in is written by Michelle Duffy and Gordon Wyatt. This article was written in 2011 and is titled Sound Diaries, a Method for Listening to Place. And so with Gershon and Daza's article, they argue for the sonic. And through Duffy and Wyatt's article, we delve deeper into one methodology of a handful, if not many, that do exist operating through the sonic. And so they use a methodology of sound diaries. And sound diaries provides a possible technique to provide partial insight into embodied knowledge that's triggered by sounds and, in other cases, music. So we look into, if we go back to who really ignited this form of research, we can look into Schaefer in about the 70s, where he conducted the Sound World Soundscape Project, and in 1994, he described soundscapes as a means to encapsulate how people inhabit and understand the sonic environment in which they live in. So we now can go into this concept of the action of listening. So within this article, Sound Diaries, a Method for Listening to Place, Duffy and Wyatt argue that there is a difference between hearing and listening. And as I previously explained, the ears are constantly listening. We constantly hear. There's no way of turning it off, turning our hearing off. Our ears are always receiving an unfiltered amount of information, of sounds, such as someone's breath, to you listening to this video, to the wheels of your chair, your computer chair moving around, the banging of pots in the kitchen. If you live in an apartment complex, upstairs, you can hear the muffled sounds of the neighbor up there, the soft hum of cars outside in the streets driving by, or beeping and so forth. So we live in a world where we're constantly exposed to information that we hear, that we listen to, which can become complicated. How does the brain process all of this information, So this leads us into the distinction between hearing and listening. So hearing, that's what we're doing. We're hearing these sounds. Awareness, it's information to inform us of dangers, of what's going on in the next room, what we're doing, and so forth. And then there's listening. And listening is a much more active hearing, as Duffy and Wyatt in the article argues. Listening is active in the sense that there's selective things that we choose to listen to, such as music. We listen to the lyrics to a conversation, listening to your partner. So there is a distinction between the two of hearing and listening. And as Wyatt and Duffy explain, quote unquote, listening is a process of actively creating and attributing meaning to soundscapes. We humans hear, but we are selective to what we listen to. And how we respond is inferred by our own backgrounds, our own life histories, our cultures, so forth, as well as what we value to listen to. This seems obvious, but I do want to lay the groundwork for this. That sound is incredibly important. It's an often overlooked sensory perception, I think. Sounds tend to or can trigger memories of past events, whether positive or negative. They can also trigger memories of faraway places, such as when you visit a relative who lives in a different city, town, or perhaps country. There are sounds that you would tend to associate with that space. Sounds can also trigger emotions. Through Duffy and Wyatt's article, they did have an example in which a woman was listening to a particular song, and she explained how this song evokes very sad memories and emotions within her due to her own past history and the connection between that memory and the song itself. But I do want to go more into Duffy and Wyatt's focus of sound diaries, just to offer you, the audience, a different sonic methodology to perhaps employ in your own work or personal lives and so forth. It's quite interesting and fascinating. So sound diaries, they specifically work with sonic knowledge, the knowing of sounds, recognition of sounds, such as the sound of dripping water from the sink, to turn it off, things like that. Sound diaries also works with experience and affects. And what Duffy and Wyatt mean by affect is that it is the innate biological response to sound, such as spine tingling or goosebumps. A good example of this, to break it down, is the sounds that are utilized in film, particularly horror films. Now, horror films really can enrich our knowledge of sounds. And so if you wanted to creep someone out in a horror film, prepare them for something bad that's going to happen to the main character, you might have the sound of a creaking door. You might have the sounds of tree branches scratching at the window. You might have sounds of floorboards creaking when we all know, both the audience and the main character in the film, that the house is empty except for them. These are examples from my own personal understanding, so please draw from your own personal experiences if there are better sounds in which to explain these things. But sounds affect how our bodies respond to a situation. And why Duffy and Wyatt chose to do sound diaries with their participants is because sound diaries kind of navigate participants to disengage with the ocular, with what they see, and rather focus inwards into how what are the effects of the sounds that they're listening to, that they're hearing, that they themselves are participating with. And the authors close out their fantastic article by this quote: "Soundscapes bring our focus back to ourselves and our place, not as separate and autonomous beings, but as connected entities. Such connections are often articulated as feelings of belonging. Sound is therefore crucial in helping individuals make sense of everyday places. Listening redirects our attention to our connectivity to the people and place of our everyday lives. Soundscape, through methodology, requires the focus of contradictions, possibilities, and unpredictable nature of how places are lived through listening bodies. So within my documentation of Anne's life through sonic means, I asked her a series of questions, the most important being, what sounds do you associate with your life here, with your practice, with making of the goat's cheese, working with them, and so forth, as well as what sounds do you find to be most important to you? And she explains, like, there's such as the first calls of the goats in the morning. It's like they're calling me mom, asking me to wake up and come milk them. Two other sounds, such as the wind that moves through the trees, the sounds of equipment clamoring about when she's making the cheese, to the sound of the stove being turned on, and so forth. And so the reasoning for this is, to offer the data that is collected to be multifaceted, to engage multiple senses, because the body does not experience life only through the ocular, but also through the sonic, through touch, sensations, through taste, and so forth. Which therefore leads us into the ocular data that I also collected. The visual data that I collected is based on film photography through the computer, or through the camera Minolta X700 SLR. Majority of the film photos captured was on the film Kodak Go 200. And the justification for using this particular film color palette was to capture the deep, rich browns, burnished reds, the touches of gold that do exist in, and as well as the other two farmers' goats' fur. I really wanted to have a richer, neutral brown palette to be more forward in the backdrop of the greens and reds, or the greens that might exist and the blues. I did use digital photography for my own personal usage of data, as well as analysis, to aid myself with the written text that I did have, and the recorded interviews. However, the exhibition and the presentation of this article is based on film, because I deliberately wanted to capture the nuances and imperfections of everyday life, and I feel that film connects us to this nostalgic era. Many of our parents and grandparents grew up shooting on film cameras, versus a lot of people my age, and of course younger, are more situated and comfortable with digital, particularly our phone cameras, very handy. So I wanted to create this nostalgic past, which kind of ties into this perception of what rural lifestyle is like. Please do not be mistaken, I do not intend to over-romanticize the farm life. And I think that's what I hope to convey through film photography, is that there are a lot of imperfections within the film photos themselves, showing the ruggedness, the hardships that these farmers do face on a day-to-day basis, and whether that be on the farm physically, financial experiences, difficulties that they may experience, to political frameworks that kind of bar them from advancing to further fields if that is the farmer's desire, and so forth. But we can go back to the theme of this article, which is documentation of intangible rural traditions and practices. So you may be asking, well, what is the rural traditions or practices of these and this farmer? And I want to state that goat farming, excuse me, goat farming itself is not uh, cultural heritage to Estonians, at least from my own collected data, observations, as well as the farmers' information that they shared with me, to books written. There is really no record of goat cheese and farming being cultural to Estonians. So, what I asked myself as well as the farmers is, well, what about this is traditional for you? What is a cultural heritage for you through goat farming? And they're like, well, it's not the goats themselves. That was a specific and deliberate choice on my behalf, but rather I would suppose that cultural heritage for Estonians is more of being a part of the land, working with the land, being stewards of the land. And so with that quote from, or general consensus amongst the farmers, that's how I wanted to operate and facilitate this article as well as the thesis that I'm working on, is that goat farming is not cultural heritage. However, the backdrop in which goat farming operates within the rural life, practices, traditions, the forest, and so forth, is very much so intrinsic and significant to Estonians and their own perceptions of cultural heritage. In a previous article, I drew on two different written works by Estonians. So what they kind of talked about is the importance of the topography and geographical makeup that heavily influence the way that Estonians have cultivated their culture, their spirituality, their understanding of the environment that they live in to this day. And while the specificity of of each farmer's reasonings for going back to the land is different, and have their own nuances, they all do have a common sentimentality of that coming back to the land is very important to their own image, to their own identity, and to themselves. And what does this mean? So, goat cheese, making goat's cheese, is a way for the farmer to actively participate with the land itself, and activate sense of value, beliefs, motivations through a tangible good. So their intangible values and beliefs are transmuted through the goat cheese itself. And it doesn't end there, actually. The goat cheese, therefore, goes into markets, stores, perhaps, people come to the farmer's home itself and buy the cheese and products from them. But then the goat's cheese goes on to live a continued life, which then creates this circle of value for the farmers themselves. Because what's most important for Anne, particularly, is that food be clean, good, and fair, that, these foods are viable, both in the sense of like, was it ecologically sustainable for me as a farmer? Is this biologically sustainable to me, to my child, to my family, and so forth, as well as to others who want to participate in this? And to participate as a farmer who creates these tangible goods, inscribed with their intangible values and practices, and of course their heritage, it's a way for them to also activate this sense of participation with other community members who also may share not exact but similar sentiments about the food that they consume. So Anne finds a niche for herself and her values, both within herself and what she chose to do within the community that she participates in, and thus the region that she lives in. And so, in conclusion, the goat's milk products that Anne makes, it's not about the products themselves. It's not about the tangible goods itself or by itself. Rather, it's a tangible commodity that is able to facilitate her belief and values into intangible aspects. So it's an amalgamation of intangible and tangible goods coming together to create a cycle of life for Anne herself. And that will be all. I do have the article written and it will soon be published. So if you are interested in reading more about these authors and articles that I've written about, please refer to the reference list. They are absolutely fascinating and I highly recommend them. And yeah, thank you for joining me for this video and for the other videos that you've participated in, both my own works as well as my colleagues' works. I know we all appreciate your support and comments and opinions. And yes, I wish you all a very happy new year, and may the new year hold many blessings and research successes. Thank you.